Is remarkable to think about the French Academy because there are a couple different things that make them wildly odd, I suppose, as an organization, and that has even made it so that there are people in France today who wonder whether or not they are still a useful organization. Um, the first and best thing about the French Academy is the fact that they called themselves the Immortals. Uh, it sounds like a Marvel franchise, doesn't it? But yes, they call themselves the Immortals. And there have been 40 chairs, right, within the French Academy. And by that, I mean that since the beginning of the French Academy, there were 40 members. And every time a member dies, that person should be replaced. And people are chosen, they are notified, they are given a chance to join, and if they do, they pronounce a discourse, right? They make a speech, they receive a green coat and a sword of some sort, and then get to call themselves immortals. And this honor has passed down through the centuries. People in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and now are still being elected as immortals and are still taking on the tasks that the French Academy has always given them. And that those tasks are really pretty much threefold, right? Define words in the French language, create a dictionary, go through the old dictionary that you have finished and determine, are there words that need to be added? Are there words that need to be removed? Are the spellings of these words still consistent? Um, so defining the French language, right? Uh, the second, defining the grammar of the French language. How should verbs work? Are the verb endings that we have chosen for things like the past tense and the past perfect and the simple past and the composed past and the pluperfect and the future, are those all still consistent with the needs of the French? Now, believe me, I don't know exactly how sometimes they determine those things, whether or not they're looking at an ending chart and saying, "Oh, the imperfect ending. Well, it's got these. We're not sure if these really fit the modern era anymore." I don't know what they're looking for specifically, but they have made changes in the last 20, 30 years. There was a push for simplification of spelling. If you know anything about the French language, there are too many letters. And just being honest, right? There are too many letters. There are a lot of letters that aren't pronounced. And the ones that aren't pronounced sometimes come up for review. Should we still have an ENT ending that sounds like nothing? Should we still have an AIENT ending that sounds like one sound, right? Um, uh, are there ways to improve the language, right? The third thing is to preserve the language in some way. So, right, define words and determine spellings, determine what grammar is supposed to look like, and then preserve the language, which is a big charge. What does it mean to preserve a language? Well, in the case of the French, it means something very, very important. When we consider English, how much has English changed even in the last 30 years? A ton. Different slangs happen all the time. And let's be honest, in France, it is not as if the language has frozen in time. As much as the French Academy has wanted to do so, it cannot freeze the language. It cannot stop the people from using the language the way that they're going to. However, it does seek to keep a lot of that slang in the mouths of the public, but also to keep it as much as possible out of things like newspapers and academic works and scientific papers and the discourse of the President of the Republic. You will not see the President of the Republic using, in official discourses, a lot of new slang because he is also part of the effort, right, to maintain and preserve the language. A place that you can kind of go to see what this might look like even a little bit better is Quebec. Quebec is a part of Canada. Canada, as you know, is not French. However, French Canada is uh, French culture, French language. And in many cases, it's French the way that it was when a lot of people moved to the New World back in the 1500s and the 1600s, which is to say that Quebecois French is sometimes considered to be older and a little bit more um, dusty, I suppose. But also, because of its proximity to English, has picked up a lot of things, has picked up slang, has picked up different words that the French themselves in France might not use. Quebecois French is a good example of what happens to a language when it is no longer under the strict controls of the Académie Française. Now, are the people in Canada who are French speakers still using the French, maybe in the way that the French Academy wants them to use it? In some cases, yes. There are people who will say if you're going to teach the French language, you're not teaching Quebecois French versus Parisian French. Is there such a thing as Quebecois French? Of course there is. Is it a hybrid French? No, not really. Is it its own language? Yes, kind of, in part. Can you find Quebecois French dictionaries? Yes, you can. Are they official? Let's not go there, right? The French would consider Quebecois French to be different. It would consider it to be a form of French. The French that I teach in my classroom is Parisian French because it's the one I learned and it's the one that we have the most structure for. So, when it comes to modern French history and we talk about the French Academy, the French Academy's job, preserving the language, is exactly that, making it into something that becomes a standard, becomes a standard bearer for the French themselves. You might note Belgian French, Swiss French are not that different from Parisian French. There are certainly things that have changed a little bit because they're in proximity to different things, right? The Swiss are in proximity to German, are in proximity to Italian, are in proximity to the other French, right? And so, it does tend to get some influences, right? Belgian French is often mixed with Flemish, right? Which is sort of a Dutch kind of language, right? And so the French Academy has as its mission the preservation of the language, which helps us to also see a lot more about why the French are the way that they are. And we will talk about that in the next video. Defining who the French are is an entire class in and of itself. I do a class called French Civilization. I'm actually doing it this semester. And I actually think it's a great thing that I'm doing it this semester because I am very much looking at both of these classes as ways as influential for each other. And that is to say that when you think about who the French are, it helps when we know what the French have come from, what they've gone through, what their history has done to them, what their location in Europe has done to them, what their battles have said about them, what their struggles with immigration and their struggles with Anglicization and modernization have what's happened there. So when it comes to thinking about the way that the French are, what are they? Who are they? What are they like? We can start with some stereotypes. I think we can start with stereotypes that are rooted in truth. We can start with some stereotypes that are not really so rooted in truth anymore, but that may have been true in the past. But also, in looking at the language as we have been, this particular chapter, section, whatever we're calling the segments of the class, um, looking at the way that the French use their language and the way that they feel about their language is essential to understanding the way that they are. The arrogance of the French, if we just put it that way, is not a false perception for the most part. Are the French a proud people? Yes, they are. Um, we can say the same thing about a lot of Americans, though. And we can also say, though, that America has 300 plus million people. The French have around 70 million. And so, a much smaller country, a much more compact country, but also a country that has a history that stretches back much, much farther than the United States of America does. As such, the language itself codified a lot of the things that the French already felt about themselves. They already saw themselves as a superpower in Europe, probably before the idea of superpower was really a thing. The French touted the fact that they had leaders and had leadership, had a people that was not going to bow to other countries. France is one of the few countries that has largely resisted invasion that led to loss of territory. In fact, it didn't really lose territory in a sense until 1870 when it lost the Franco-Prussian War and had to give up Alsace and part of Lorraine. And we'll get to that right at the end of the semester, later on in the semester. But up to that point, even if the French were invaded, even if the French had incursions into their territory, it did not split the people in half, or it did not break off pieces of the French um, to push them into the arms of another country. Part of this is geographic. The French are fortunate to be surrounded on almost every single side by natural barriers. Um, so in the map of France, you will see that there's a lot of water. So there's water between the French and the British. There's water between the French and the African continent, and there are mountains between the French and Italy, between the French and the Swiss, between the French and the Germans for part of it. There are high hills, Alsace and Lorraine, right, that also sort of wall off part of the country. And really, the Belgians are about the only people that they could just sort of walk across a border pretty easily, right? Otherwise, you got some mountains to go over, you got some hills to go through, you got some natural defenses. The border with Spain, the Pyrenees, lots of Pyrenees, right? So getting through there, again, natural barriers. So the French have effectively had a lot of their territory determined by geography. And as such, any sort of invader would then have to deal with that. But also, in general, the French were never split into different groups. Now, is that to say there aren't different groups within the French country itself? Clearly, there are. There are differences in culture. There are differences in the languages that they spoke for a long time in various parts of France. There are still parts of France that are kind of upset about being French. So there is, right, this idea of independence because they have been their own thing for such a long time. They have not been a part of any other country. And at the same time, there is a rebellious streak, right? We are independent, but we also don't want people to tell us what to do. And that is going to be a very big deal towards the end of this semester, where we're going to see that when the French got word that they were going to be united under people like Napoleon, and that codes were going to go out, and they were all going to have to do the same thing. There were people who weren't happy when it came to saying this is what education is going to look like everywhere. There were people who weren't very happy because they said we live in a different place and we don't believe that our education should be the same as the education of somebody from Paris. So, yeah, there is a lot of contradictory culture within France, and we are going to talk about a lot of that. Um, but a lot of it still does come back to the idea that when you are proud of a language, when you are proud of a culture that you've built around a language, and when you are proud now that you've had this Académie Française that has preserved the language, that has made it into something that gives you access to all the literature that has been um, presented as essential, yeah, it gives you some pride. And that can make uh, it a little bit difficult as an outsider to feel like they can get through those barriers to really get to know who the French are. So we're going to keep talking about this in the next video. Enjoy all the costume changes. You're going to see them throughout the semester. Um, so when we think about how the French and their language really make contemporary France into what it is, and what make very modern, current day France into what it is, I think we have to look at, again, the idea that a language and the pride that you have in a language can be both a very good thing, but also something that at times may prevent you from interacting with other cultures as effectively as you could. I want to be very careful in saying that because I think it is a very complex equation when we think about language and when we think about the way that language works. The French, in turning their language into this sort of monolithic, very regimented, very correct, very codified system, where it's fairly easy to go back in and say this is the right way to use it, this is the wrong way to use it, this is the right pronunciation, this is the wrong pronunciation, turns your perception of your language and your culture into something that can be a little bit difficult to break through for other cultures, right? And so I think when we consider the idea of standard versus non-standard English, we think of the way that we as Americans may approach our language, we are a little bit more open, to variety in our language, in saying that there are vernaculars, that there are, for lack of a better term, creoles, that there are slangs that will work in certain areas differently than they work in other areas. Now, clearly, we've seen this throughout history where certain, slang and jargon, appears in various places. That, the 70s had its own type of slang and its own type of thing where we would be able to differentiate between class, between culture, between various groups based on the way that they spoke. Famously, for example, in the movie Airplane, if you've never seen it before, go watch it. It's fun. There is somebody who speaks with the slang of jive, right, which was a slang that was particularly popular among the African American population at the time. And they have a joke in that particular movie where somebody claims that they can speak jive and translate for somebody else, right? And it's funny, right? It's meant to be a funny part of the movie, but also it does remind us that we do have various places where our language differs from person to person. Um, for the French, they were kind of trying to avoid that for the longest time. And when you put as much time and effort into creating a language that you really value and think is pretty perfect, it can become difficult as outsiders to get inside. This is one thing that we're going to be learning and talking about throughout this semester is when it comes to that stereotypical idea of the way the French deal with language and the reason that they're so protective and maybe rude about their language when it comes to outsiders trying to speak it. Is it strictly a stereotype? No. But is it also something that the French are guilty of from time to time? For sure, right? It's not at all uncommon to, even for me, if I travel to France, to find people who would really rather do English, right? But in many cases, right, this can be a misperception of intent. Um, I think that as we've seen in these last couple of videos, right, the idea of a language, the idea of starting with language is an important one because I think it opens us up to the amount of nuance that goes into learning about modern French history. Knowing about history involves knowing about the way that people are. Knowing the way that people are helps us sometimes to interpret better and to understand better the way that historical events occurred, the reason that they were the way that they were, um, but also the way that we um, sort of see the interaction of any culture with history and historical um, trends. So, in the next video, I want to spend one last little bit of time talking through where we are coming from and where we are starting, right, with this particular class talking about contemporary France. So, see you in a moment. So, the last portion of this, right, is talking through, again, where are the French coming from? How are we starting? So, to summarize, right, what we've already talked about is the fact that for this class, we are considering the beginning of contemporary modern France with as coinciding with the foundation of the French Academy, right? The Académie Française and the codifying of the French language. Very important for the French. Um, but we cannot neglect the Revolution, clearly. The French, as a people, um, have always been very independent, very don't tell us what to do. And this was reflected in the run up to the um, French Revolution. It did not start that way. When the Catholic Church first came into France and began crowning their kings, putting them forth as kind of the equivalent of, emperors chosen by God um, and kings chosen by God. Um, this worked pretty well up until the 1600s ish, 1600s, 1700s. And if I sound maybe a little hesitant as I'm talking about this, it's a complex thing. Um, Dogmas within the Catholic Church were so important for such a long time because, again, of language. Many people in France did not know how to read. Many people in France only really learned anything about literature through either storytelling, oral tradition, right? Or the most important oral tradition, the Catholic Church and the Scripture. And we all know of France as a place of many cathedrals, lots of stained glass. What does the stained glass do? Well, it's storytelling. And it's storytelling, but without necessarily the benefit of a people being able to read that story themselves. They look at the pictures, they get the interpretation from the pulpit, but they themselves are not really reading these things. They are understanding them through somebody else. And so you get a lot of control in basically two of the three classes in France: royalty, who tells you what to do because they are in political power, and the church, who tells you what to do because they're in religious power. And it is not until the French Academy comes around, codifies the language, starts to make it easier for literacy and for scholarship to happen, and does kind of open up the culture to being able to be more literate. What happens when people become more literate? Well, people like Voltaire and Montesquieu, that we're going to be seeing, begin the process of what becomes known as the Enlightenment, where dogma begins to fall away a little bit, where people begin to say, look, this is what I've been told, but I want to make a decision for myself. And so the French have gone from being this people that is very proud of who they are, of the independence that they've had in Europe, of the ability that they've had to fight off invasions, to keep their territory their own, to at times modify their beliefs slightly in order to keep themselves safe, as the Normans do in the northern part of France when the Vikings come, and kings basically say, look, as long as you don't stop us from living our lives, we won't stop you either. Back in a second. With all of that, this independence, this ability to sort of modify a culture and norms in order to make sure that independence could be achieved and maintained, the French continue to say, well, the Vikings are in our territory. The English have been here before. Other cultures have tried to move in, and what we've done is we've allowed them to assimilate with us rather than really assimilating with them, even though we made concessions about the way that the Vikings could interact in the northern part of France and what they could do. Eventually, those people kind of became part of our culture. And so the French were very used to people just assimilating, taking on their cultural traits, taking on their cultural norms, taking on their language. And this, continues up through the Enlightenment. And it's not that things change drastically in the Enlightenment, it's just simply that people suddenly realize that now that education is in their hands, now that they are being presented with logical arguments for why dogma doesn't necessarily need to rule over everything, it can still be an important part of culture, but it doesn't overtake everything. There is also independent thought and free will and a need to question. Suddenly, things begin to shift a little bit. And so, this has been now a constant evolution of a people that have sought to figure out how to take everything and turn it into them, right? Bringing in uh, people from across the borders and saying, if you're going to be a part of France, this is who you're going to be. And we see this repeated, right, throughout the centuries that follow, to the point where we understand better. What was Napoleon's deal? Well, he was doing the same thing that the French had always done, saying, here is our culture, here is our way of doing things. We think everybody else should do the same, right? The Napoleonic Wars are all about that. The conquests of different countries and saying, this is something that we want for ourselves. We want to bring in things and make them ours. Has This sort of thing has continued into the modern era, and we will be able to see as we move into the latter part of this semester how that's become even more complicated now that we've got people who have moved to France who don't necessarily want to just simply become one monolithic France. France has never been monolithic. Let's be very clear. There have always been independent groups within France. The problem is that a lot of people in France always assumed that France was France and it was just the way that it was, without necessarily realizing that they have always been assimilating new ideas and always been taking in new things, and that these things have softly become part of French culture. That Southern French culture, Northern French culture are different. Uh, but if the people expressing those views look like the rest of the French, that's fine. Now, however, that we have all this migration, when people suddenly don't look like the rest of the French and are also saying, this is also our culture and we want to do things with it the way that we want to do things with it, suddenly it becomes a problem. So, in this particular course, to sort of summarize everything, we are going to be looking at all of that complexity. What does the modern contemporary French culture look like? How has it evolved from where we are beginning with the French language to our modern era, and a Europe that is now dealing with the repercussions of the colonization and the domination of other cultures throughout the world, that's now kind of coming home to their own right backyards. So, I want this course to be fun. I want this course to be full of debate. I want to talk through a lot of these things. I want to look at this as a course that really tries to be fair to the French and to the culture of France and to the modern history of France without making excuses for some of the things that have happened. I think that's very important, that when we look at this historically, um, saying that certain things that happened were fine, it's part of the way the culture was, is probably not what we're going to do. We're going to be looking at things critically as well, certainly providing reasons for why a lot of these things happened. Why did colonization take place? If we agree that it did not benefit Africa and many of the places where it took place, we can also look at it and say, here are, however, some of the things that were the result. Some of those things have been turned to the good. Certainly, it is not a good reason to have done them in the first place, and to have colonized and enslaved. Um, but cultures are resilient and have often turned those tragedies to the good because they are resilient, right? Because they have done that, right? Again, not excusing it, um, but simply looking at it for sort of what it might be. So, welcome to the course. It's going to be a fun semester. We're going to have a lot to talk about, and I especially look forward to our Friday meetings where we really kind of get into this discussion of contemporary French culture and what it means to be French in the modern era. So there you go. I will talk to you soon.